The Harlem Hellfighters' determination knows no color. Even though the Harlem Hellfighters were abused and segregated during World War I, they were still determined to try their best to gain respect of the other soldiers and to show the importance of African Americans. The early 1900s were a time when Jim Crow's laws dictated where blacks went, ate, slept, and learned. It banned them from specific facilities and what they can and can't do. Jim Crow's laws enforced racial segregation in the southern states. We must not eat with them, must not shake hands with them, seek to talk to them, or meet them outside the requirements of military service. We must not command too highly of these troops, especially in front of the white Americans. General John J. Pershing.
Due to the Jim Crow laws, opportunities were scarce. The dreams of black and white fighting side by side in the war, working together in harmony, seemed absurd, impossible even. Meanwhile, overseas, neighboring countries start to form more conflicts with each other. The fragile peace soon will break when a young Siberian named Gavrilo Princip brutally murders both Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his pregnant wife Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg. Along with numerous conflicts between the countries, the assassination of Archduke, heir to the throne, sparked the war. The war had two sides: the Allies, which is composed of Serbia, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Belgium, and the United States. The Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. Sensing imminent danger, the U.S. declares war on Germany,
Gathering as many teenagers and adults to join the war. Many of blacks were discouraged from joining the war since they were treated like animals. Blacks who yearned to join the military were continually rejected due to their so-called inferiority. W. E. B. Du Bois, an activist, writer, and psychologist, inspired many blacks to join the war. Only by joining the cause and fighting side by side can men gain respect from others and be treated like normal human beings. After over 350,000 blacks enlisted in the army, only 4 regiments were open to the blacks. The men were split into factions. They were segregated from war and left to unload boats and build latrines instead of going into combat. After a while, the French needed replacements. After multiple rejection, the U.S. gave the 369th Infantry to the French.
The Harlem Hellfighters was a regiment of New York National Guardsmen in the First World War. They were set up to fail by their own government. They were humiliated, degraded, eventually given to the French army as a throwaway, and they ended up coming home as one of the most decorated units in the entire U.S. Army.
On January 1st, 1918, the 369th Infantry arrived in France. They continued to do the same tedious work. After the Harlem Hellfighters replenished the French ranks, they were given the chance that the white wouldn't give them, the chance to fight. Throughout the course of 6 months in the war, the 369th Infantry earned their reputation as fearless, but at the cost of 1,500 casualties. From their enemy, the Germans, they were given the name Hellfighter, which would later be renamed the Harlem Hellfighters. Once they came back home in 1919, they were paraded down the street and were entitled as the world's best African American faction. The Harlem Hellfighters were given respect they long dreamt of, but it wasn't like that for everyone.
After many horrific events that occurred after the war, many activists were inspired to fight against the injustice, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, etc. These famous African Americans sparked a chain of events which would lead to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act prohibits all forms of discrimination. In society today, many African Americans were able to join the war or go anywhere they want without getting discriminated because of their race. But back then, while the Harlem Hellfighters were getting glorified and praised, many other black soldiers and citizens were facing the worst racial violence in the history of man, known as the Red Summer. The Red Summer is a series of events where whites started to kill the blacks for their skin tone. They were lynched, burned, stabbed, and worst of all, they were still discriminated. African Americans eventually got tired of being bullied and stood up. Many blacks started to protest by killing Americans. It was considered the worst racial violence in the history of man, but it stood as a pillar of the civil rights movement. Meanwhile, tensions between Tsar, Emperor of Russia, and the citizens start to grow, due to many poor decisions made by leaders and that the Russian army was not capable of battling other countries. The citizens eventually had enough and started the Russian Revolution of 1917. Many of the citizens started to riot over the scarcity of food. Eventually, the emperor was forced to abdicate. When his brother, Grand Duke Michael, refused to take the throne, the rule of the Romanov dynasty soon came to an end. Later on in the 1960s, many activists started to rise up and stand up to inequality. The Harlem Hellfighters stood as a gateway for influential events such as the African American Civil Rights Movement, is where blacks started to protest against injustice. This eventually leads to the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
The Civil Rights Act was an act that prohibited discrimination in public places. This allowed many African Americans to join the war or go to a public bathroom. Now there are more than hundreds of thousands compared to the few thousand in World War I.
In 2004, the Harlem Hellfighters were honored by Spartanburg, South Carolina for their work and their determination. In the proclamation it states, in 1917, upon hearing that black soldiers would be training in his city, the mayor of Spartanburg, J.F. Floyd, said the following. I was sorry to learn that the 15th Regiment has been ordered here, for with their northern ideas about race equality, they would probably expect to be treated like white men. I can say right here that they will not be treated anything except Negroes. Even in 2005, former President Barack Obama awarded the medal posthumously to an African American named Private Henry Johnson, who allegedly fought off German raid but actions were ignored for decades.
A German raiding party, at least a dozen soldiers, maybe more, fired a hail of bullets. Henry fired back until his rifle was empty. Then he and Needham threw grenades. Both of them were hit. Needham lost consciousness. Two enemy soldiers began to carry him away while another provided cover, firing at Henry. But Henry refused to let them take his brother in arms. He shoved another magazine into his rifle. It jammed. He turned the gun around and swung it at one of the enemy, knocking him down. Then he grabbed the only weapon he had left, his bolo knife, and went to rescue Needham. Henry took down one enemy soldier, then the other. The soldier he knocked down with his rifle recovered, and Henry was wounded again, but armed with just his knife, Henry took him down too. And finally, reinforcements arrived, and the last enemy soldier fled. As the sun rose, the scale of what happened became clear. In just a few minutes of fighting, 2 Americans defeated an entire raiding party.
Private Henry Johnson had 21 stab wounds in him, and yet he still wouldn't die. He and his friends survived, but at the cost of being forgotten for decades. Though they did not abolish discrimination, and it still exists in the smallest crevices in the world.
They were able to give the public a voice they needed to stand up against the discrimination. They inspired many activists to protest and to raise awareness about this injustice. They were able to spark a new generation of awareness of discrimination, such as the Women's Civil Rights Movement, African American Civil Rights Movement, the Humane Movement, etc. All of these movements happened because of the Harlem Hellfighters' work and reputation. It all happened because of the Harlem Hellfighters. They lived in a generation where their own country turned against them and waged war on them, yet with their courage and determination, they brushed off the discrimination and charged into war, for they knew it was the only way to earn respect. Though there are many claims and stories about soldiers charging in the face of death, or that they were the best infantry or aerial group, it would be hard to find one that was discriminated throughout their entire life and yet be still able to compromise, like the Harlem Hellfighters. They truly showed those who doubted that a black could do a white's job that determination knows no color.